she probably knew what she was dealing with. She probably confided in her family and her friends and was looking for a way to get out. And we know that in cases of intimate violence, the most dangerous time is when someone is leaving the relationship.
Welcome to the global phenomenon, Surviving the Survivor, where we're all just trying to survive in a rough world.
What's up, STS Nation, and welcome to another episode of Surviving the Survivor, where we promise to bring you the best guests in all of true crime, and this episode is no exception. But first, we want to say that our thoughts are with the missing mother of three, Ana Walshe. The search for the missing Cohasset, Massachusetts mother entered its 10th day. She has not been seen since the early hours of New Year's Day, officially reported missing on January 4th. Our best guest lineup today featured two very interesting individuals. The first is an internationally recognized expert in the security realm. Anthony Amore has also worked in homeland security at the federal level in aviation and facility security, as well as immigration enforcement. He is also an expert, and listen to this, in matters related to security, fine art, and in the theft of highly valuable property, including rare masterpieces. He's one of the world's top experts in the field of stolen art investigations. Anthony is the best-selling author of Stealing Rembrandts. His second book, The Art of the Con, was a New York Times bestseller in crime. And he also has a book out called The Woman Who Stole Vermeer. He just recently wrote an article for the Boston Globe in the last day or two called Brian Walsh and the Art of the Sloppy Con, which he will walk us through momentarily. We're joined also by Dr. Daniel Bober, a board certified in general psychiatry, child and adolescent psychiatry, and forensic psychiatry by the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology. He is also a diplomat of the American Board of Addiction Medicine, meaning he is a certified addiction medicine physician. Some quick housekeeping notes. Please follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. On Twitter, we're a podcast STS. You can support us at Patreon. You can listen to us anywhere podcasts are found. And as my 8-year-old daughter likes to say, please subscribe and hit that like button. It gets the algorithm chugging. With that said, there is a bit of news just coming out, and I will reveal it right now. Ana Walshe, this mother who is missing, told police, this according to the Boston Globe via a local news reporter, told police in 2014 that her now husband, Brian, had threatened to kill her, according to a police report, and a person briefed on the matter. To the psychiatrist first on this, does this surprise you at all, Dr. Bober?
No, it doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, we've seen cases like this before. Think about Lacey Peterson. This is a situation where it's been building for a long time, probably months, if not years. She probably knew what she was dealing with. She probably confided in her family and her friends and was looking for a way to get out. And we know that in cases of intimate violence, the most dangerous time is when someone is leaving the relationship. So she very well may have been hours, if not days, away from leaving. And him, in his last stab, if you will, his last, gasp of power, took her out because of his ego and the fact that he felt like he was being abandoned.
This article in the Boston Globe goes on to say that about a year before they were engaged, Ana Walshe, then Anna Knipp, K-N-I-P-P, told Metropolitan Police in Washington, D.C. that a man threatened her during a telephone call and said he was going to kill her and her friend. Now, the report doesn't identify the man by name, but there are sources who say it was, in fact, Brian Walsh, who many suspect of this crime. Anthony, hearing this news right now, what comes to mind?
Well, first, I loved hearing the doctor's analysis of this. So in terms of that sort of personality, I think it's very interesting analysis, doctor. I think what comes to mind from my perspective, from a criminal perspective, is the idea that he has lived a very chaotic life. He's done a lot of things that I would deem antisocial, in terms of ripping off his father for $500,000, taking a loan from a good friend, would have to be an extremely good friend, I'd say, for $500,000, and then walking away from it, not paying him back. These sorts of behaviors, and of course, the art crime that he committed, which was just a blatant, sloppy act of fraud against innocent dupes. They point to the sort of person who would be involved in perhaps a disappearance or a violent crime. Of course, we don't know which has occurred at this point, but he certainly doesn't lend a lot of confidence in his background when you read it, when you think of him vis-a-vis the ongoing investigation.
And Anthony, you happen to be an expert in art fraud. That's what I love about my job in the media. I always talk to fascinating people. How in the world does one become an expert in art theft?
Well, I had spent the early part of my career as a federal agent and as a government security person, helping to rebuild security at Logan Airport after 9/11. So I had this experience in security and investigations. And in 2005, I went over to the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, which 32 years ago was victimized in the biggest property heist in the history of the world, when more than $500 million worth of art was stolen. So 17 years I've been investigating that case on behalf of the museum, side by side with an FBI agent, and really jumped right into the world of art crime and studied it obsessively. I've written a bunch of books on it. So I think that it's a field that is pretty niche, but occasionally you do see a nexus between art crime and violent crime, and I've worked on cases where the two have intersected before.
And there's an excellent documentary on Netflix about that crime that Anthony speaks of, worth a watch. So there's some other news. Apparently, Ana Walshe sold off her assets, according to reports, for cash just days before her disappearance, even leaving behind a note. Friends tell NBC Washington that she'd been rushing to get rid of assets, including her apartment and car, in late December. Dr. Bober, does this sound to you like a person who was worried about imminent danger or an imminent threat, who was just trying to basically get out of Dodge and escape?
Well, I think when you look at these cases, it's important to retrace the steps of the person in the weeks and the months leading up to their disappearance. And you always have to pay attention to these very, big decisions in life, like transferring assets, things that are outside the norm. So you have to believe that something was happening, something was going on that was leading up to something big. And maybe she was about to leave. Like I said, this is pure speculation based on what I'm seeing because I've never evaluated him or interviewed him. But it's, these are the actions of someone who's getting ready to do something, who's getting ready to make a change, something big, a transition. So I think it's something that, we need to pay attention to.
And I think you were saying when we were talking off camera that every family has a secret, at least one. Is that kind of a hard and fast rule that you found as a psychiatrist?
Yes, that every family has its secrets, and no one knows what goes on between two people except for the two people. We see all these celebrity couples on Instagram and on TV. Even our own friends, we look at their marriages, we say, "Wow, they really have the perfect relationship. They're so happy together." And then you find out, a month later that they're getting a divorce, and you're like, "Wow, I didn't see that coming." It's because with people, you only get two things. What they want to see and what they show you. So people live a life that's really a projection. It's sort of their representative, if you will. I call it the Facebook fallacy. You go on Facebook and you see people with their baby bumps on their ski trips, and everyone seems so happy. And then you find out that they're suffering from drug addiction, or they're about to get a divorce, or they just lost their job. In our society, especially in Western society, we're so concerned about status and image, and we have to have it all together. God forbid we show any weakness, any vulnerability. So I think it's important for people to project that image that they have it all together, but we know from our own friends and our own family that a lot of people don't have it together.
And I'll one up you on that and I'll dub it Instagram insincerity. I always see my wife scrolling through Instagram. Everyone's life looks so perfect, and exactly like you said, then you find out, the husband's having an affair with another man or
Or the
whatever it
wife
is.
just got out of rehab or something like that.
Yeah,
Nope,
it's
exactly.
always something. So back to the latest news here. There also appears to have been a message written on the side of a champagne box. We all know that, according to the husband, Brian Walsh, he disappeared New Year's Day. And that message says, and I'm going to quote here, "Wow, 2022, what a year. And yet we are still here and together. Let's make 2023 the best one yet. Exclamation mark. We are the authors of our lives. Courage, love, perseverance, compassion, and joy. Love, Anna." To the non-psychiatrist, Anthony Amore, who's got love in his last name, does it sound like she was full of it in terms of being full of love here, or do you think this was just some cryptic, insincere little, message that she left on a bottle, not in a bottle?
It's very difficult, because as the doctor said, we don't know these people, and I don't know her. I don't have a baseline for her. I don't know how she communicated with her husband. Typically, you both refer to Instagram aptly. Anna's Instagram portrayed a beautiful, happy, glamorous, fulfilling life filled with luxuries, and we didn't know what was going on behind the scenes. It seems like some of it could have been a facade. This note that she left could have been a facade. Joel, I mentioned I watch your broadcast, and I watch it a lot because of the Idaho murders, which just captivated a large portion of the nation. And because I'm an investigator, I watch it thinking to myself, what we know is such a small little piece of what the investigators know. In the Idaho case, bore that out, right? When we saw that affidavit, the probable cause affidavit, and you saw what was in it, and that's just a fraction of what the police knew. It was nothing like what the public thought. And the same is true when we talk about the Walsh family. God only knows what was going on inside the home. Perhaps he was very, very angry. Perhaps, and again, it's hypothetical. Perhaps on New Year's Eve, he was expressing doubt in her and in her fidelity, and that's why she left a note like that, to quell him until she could get things in order. It's all, until we know the facts, it's all conjecture about the note, but it's at best, all I can say is it's interesting and perplexing.
And Anthony, it warmed my heart to find out you're a member of STS Nation before we ever met. So thank you for watching. We appreciate it. To you, Doctor, this message, wow, 2022, we are the authors of our lives. Courage, love, perseverance, compassion, and joy. Sounds very much like an Instagram post to me. How does it read to you?
Oh, I think it's less concerning what was on the surface of the bottle than what was being bottled up. And again, the image that she was projecting, which, again, this happens all the time. It's all great. Everything is wonderful. My marriage is great. My job is great. I just got a promotion. So again, all these people, why do people post their lives on Facebook and Instagram? They put a completely sanitized, idealized image of their life. And I think that's what's going on here. Again, I think she's, dressing up her life and making it look like everything is fine, but we know that it was quite different than that.
By the way, just for the record, I don't do that. I just posted a diatribe of mine aimed at my 3 young kids who don't even know what a rotary phone is. And I was yelling at them and told them I didn't have Google, told them I had encyclopedias, I had to go to a library. Anyway, I got out of hand. So not sanitized on my end, but I digress. So, Anthony, you wrote an interesting article, basically calling Brian Walsh a sloppy con man. Tell us, if you can, the thesis of the article and what you found out in writing it.
Well, the article is based on his crimes committed in the realm of art, and I was aware of his fraud from a few years ago because I know the FBI agent who investigated the case. I know her very well. She's a top-notch agent. And when you look at what he did when he was what he did in a nutshell, it's much more complex than this. But he had a friend in South Korea who bought some art. I was going to say it with the Boston accent there. I'm sorry. He bought
Please
some
do. I
art.
love it.
Your non-regional diction, right?
Right. I'm trying to
Right.
do that Mid-Atlantic accent instead.
Right.
So his friend purchased some art, and it was a couple of Warhols, 3 of them, and a couple of Keith Haring pieces and a piece of statuary. Anyway, Walsh told him, I could sell this for you in the United States, and then instantly went into a fraud scheme. Instantly puts the Warhols up for sale on eBay using Anna's account. But when the person in California purchases these for $80,000, what he sends, the courier, are not the real Warhols. They're bad imitations of them. And it's just sloppy. And for instance, when he put them on eBay to sell them, one of the great identifiers are the stamps that he claimed were on the back of these paintings, because he had the real ones. But the ones he sent with the courier didn't have these stamps. I mean, it's an obvious fraud. It's not hard to figure out. As soon as the purchaser, who was an art dealer in California, received the Warhols, he looked at them and knew on their face that these were fakes. So in a lot of art fraud schemes like this, and this is what my book is about, you don't see great forgers. In the movies you do, right? But a great art scam, a great art forgery scam is never about how great the artist is, because scientists and connoisseurs can pretty quickly tell that they're fakes. It's about 2 things. It's about the willing dupe who wants to get something that nobody else has or for a great price. But more importantly, about the fraudster and the nerve that they have. I refer to it almost like a Superman complex, where they just believe they're so smart and so able that they can pull something over on anyone. And that's why they'll bring forth these pieces that are easily discerned as fakes and sell them. It takes a lot of gumption to do something like that. We all think of crazy schemes in our head. We're sitting in traffic and we think, how I could make $1 million, but you would never do it. These people do it. And that's what Brian Walsh did, right? He had this crazy idea and did it. And it's that willingness to take that step over the line that he has shown many times in his life, whether he's been prosecuted for it or not. And so again, the art scheme, lousy. The willingness to do it, great on his part, the willingness, right? And it worked. He sold them for $80,000. The guy called him out on it. He sent him back $30,000 and kept giving him excuses about the other 50 until the person called the FBI. And that's how he was ultimately arrested.
I feel like a Warhol would be, it's not more than 80 grand. I feel like it would be more than 80 grand, but I don't know.
Right. The 2 together, well, they were small works on paper. We're not talking about the big silk screens. Yeah. And they weren't the famous ones. These were called shadows, these 2. And, it's different than, say, a Rembrandt where it's hand painted and this and that. It's not the big silk screen. So the smaller works would be of lesser value. But again, it wasn't about Warhol. It wasn't about Keith Haring. It was about lying to a very, very good friend of his in South Korea. This person was very close to him and very trusting, saying I can sell them, and immediately going about a scam to rip people off repeatedly.
And Dr. Bober, to you, I mean, there's obviously a financial motive to sell fake art, but what does it say about what's going on inside his mind that he believes he can get away with this?
So most people who aren't sociopaths or psychopaths operate on the principle that they're motivated for reward, and they try to avoid punishment or negative consequences. Psychopaths or antisocial people or sociopaths, they all are different names, but they all have overlapping characteristics. They will take on these challenges. They have no aversion. They have no fear of getting caught. And also, art fraud, which is a fairly sophisticated crime if you're doing it well, he obviously thought he was a lot smarter than he was, or he was just very sloppy about it. So it just shows his inflated sense of self-worth and his abilities, and just how sloppy he was and how poorly thought out this was. And again, a guy who is so impressed with himself, but is severely lacking in the judgment and in the foresight of what he's doing to enter into something that, again, requires a high level of sophistication. There's a lot of other cons, a lot of other scams he could have pulled that were a lot simpler, but he chose to do something, and it just shows how poorly planned this was.
Because this is my background, I'm just curious. Anthony, has every single media outlet in the greater Boston area, have they reached out to you for comment?
Not yet. No. Interestingly, I know them all from the case that I work on is very, very popular. They're, right now, understandably, the media is focused on homicide. And although, again, as I mentioned, it hasn't been declared a homicide investigation. We don't know if she's missing or a victim of a violent crime. And I loved when the doctor spoke about Anna's actions leading up to her disappearance. And then the other part of the investigation is his actions after the disappearance, right? And his actions since the disappearance have been so deceptive that he has been arrested and arraigned and charged with misleading the police because he is not helped. He's lied, allegedly lied about his whereabouts and his actions. And again, as the doctor just mentioned, really said it very well, his lies about what he did in the days after the disappearance are so extreme in that they're so easily discerned and proven. I mean, I happen to have spent most of my life in the very neighborhood that his mother lives in. At one time, I lived basically next door to his mother. And he mentioned going to the Whole Foods and the CVS in Swampscott, where I was every day. And anybody going into these places realizes that there are cameras all over the place. It is very easy to tell if you've been in there or not, and if you've purchased things or not. And likewise, having gone to Home Depot, not telling the police that, and having bought $450 worth of cleaning items, the idea that he could lie about these things to the police and get away with it illustrates what the doctor was talking about regarding his personality type.
And not to mention, he was allegedly wearing an ankle monitor for the federal fraud case. Anthony, do we know if he had it on? Some people said maybe the battery died, maybe he cut it off. Have you heard any further news about that?
I haven't. I would be shocked if the battery died. I would be even more shocked if he cut it off, because if he cut it off, the authorities would know and he would have been charged.
What I had heard was that yes, he was wearing an ankle monitor, but it was not GPS tracked. So in other words, he would leave the residence and he would say, "Okay, I need an hour to go out to the store," but there wasn't GPS monitoring capability. So in his mind, he may have thought, "Well, if I could just make it to Home Depot real quick, I can be back in an hour when they're expecting me." So that was something I read in another outlet, so it may or may not be true.
No, I think that sounds very familiar, doctor. And if memory serves me right, I could be wrong, but I think he did give an excuse for where he was going. He just didn't go to the places he said he was going to.
It was ice cream with his kids, I believe.
I think that's the one he actually did go to. I think the one thing he actually was accurate about was ice cream with the kids. But one of the things we hadn't mentioned too about his behavior leading up to the crime are the internet searches that the police have found. Talking about dismembering a body and disposing of 115-pound, with the odd specificity in there too, disposing of a body the size of his wife. So it's highly unlikely his 6-year-old did that search on his iPad. So when you look at these sorts of things, I think I could probably speak for you guys as well. I've never searched for anything like that before.
Yeah.
You know, I think about Bonnie and Clyde. You know, a lot of people said, "Well, why did Bonnie and Clyde get caught?" And a lot of it had to do with the invention of the police radio. That they started using police radios, so it was easier for law enforcement to radio ahead and say, you know, they were seen at XYZ place. But now, with all the technology we have between cell phones and credit card transactions and license plate readers and surveillance cameras, it's very hard to move around without leaving some sort of digital trail or signature. And I think people forget that, which makes crime, you know, thank goodness, a lot harder to commit.
It's so true. You know, in the course of my work looking for stolen art, I speak to a lot of organized crime members and criminals. And I was speaking to a member of the mafia who was telling me that very thing. You can't kill people now.
Right, it's not like the good old days.
Right.
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 Like in the 70s when you could just dump a body in the Meadowlands or something like
Right,
that.
or right in front of Sparks
Or in
Steakhouse.
Howard Beach or
Right, exactly.
Jersey, my home state. But doctor, to you, how can one have such a seemingly large ego and an inflated sense of self, and at the same time be doing something as incredibly dumb and stupid as Googling, as Anthony said, how to dispose of a 115-pound woman's body? It seems counterintuitive.
Oh, because he's not as smart as he thinks he is, you know? Anyone who watches even any one of these crime shows knows that the first thing they're gonna do on his computer is digital forensics. They're gonna look at all his search history. They're gonna completely dissect his life digitally and electronically. And anyone would know that. I mean, it's the most elementary thing, you know, use someone else's computer, use someone else's phone, leave your phone at home. There's a million things that he could have done that are so simple and so elementary, but again, because he has an unrealistic sense of who he is and an inflated ego, he doesn't have the insight to realize that he's making all these stupid mistakes. In his mind, he thinks he's probably a master criminal.
And then, Anthony, you mentioned this South Korea trip. According to reports, on that trip, he became so enraged while trying to bring stuff back that they weren't allowing him to take. And I forget the specifics and the details. According to the friend, he actually picked up like a stanchion and tried to attack the airport workers. So, doctor, to you, I mean, if you're that volatile, assuming this is true, and you can fly off the handle, if you do it once, can you expect that to be a pattern in his behavior?
Yes, and if in fact he is a psychopath, we know that psychopaths make up about 1% of the general population, but they make up about 20% of the prison population. We know that psychopaths have a very high rate of recidivism, up to 90% within 10 years after being released from prison. They also have a much higher risk of violence, several fold. So he probably is a guy who has a propensity for violence. He has, you know, a short fuse, and he uses violence in his mind to resolve some of these disputes without even thinking it through. And that's probably a very impulsive side of him.
Now, Anthony, you'd mentioned, I think, off camera that you were checking out the Instagram profile of Ana Walshe. She wasn't wearing a wedding band, I think you said, but we're getting some more information. She, according to reports, edited a caption just before submitting a letter to a judge in her husband's art fraud case, urging a no jail sentence. The picture claimed to show injuries resulting from a fall at work. And she writes, this is back on May 21st of 2018. She writes on the Instagram caption, mild concussion, bruised hip, and a cut. Hashtag vulnerability. And you can see her with a cut above her eye. Doctor, I'm not suggesting that this was necessarily a result of domestic abuse, but in many instances, victims will cover it up with an excuse, correct?
Absolutely. Also, victims who are, or people, whether it's a spouse, who are victims of domestic violence, very often there's a pattern of escalation. You know, we all remember the O.J. Simpson case. We all remember how, you know, how many times the police had to come to his house because he beat her up. And we remember what the outcome was with the jury. So there was a crescendo or an escalation where they sort of up the ante, they become more violent, and the person stays because to them it becomes the new normal. So they habituate to it until finally the final act is often their death.
I thought, if I could jump in really quick, I thought that an interesting thing about that, and even though she edited it, she left in the hashtag vulnerability. Now, if I or my partner, if she fell in the hall and was hurt badly, I wouldn't consider her, and she wouldn't consider herself vulnerable. Maybe klutzy or that sort of thing.
Clumsy, right?
Unlucky, clumsy, but not vulnerable. But when you're 5'2" and 112 pounds or whatever she was, and you have a person with a violent temper, as displayed by this instance with the stanchion, then you might consider yourself vulnerable.
It's an interesting word, right?
Yeah.
Very astute coming from a former investigator to pick out that word. She also in this letter, and I thought this was interesting from a psychological point, states that her husband Brian helped her mother through a traumatic health event. Now, the mother, who is Serbian, my beautiful mother, is actually from Serbia too. That in this letter says Brian helped her get through a traumatic health event. We find out from the mother herself that it was a stroke. She had, bleeding on the brain, I believe. What I find interesting about this is, assuming this is all on the up and up, Anna, and doctor, correct me if I'm wrong here, is, I don't want to say making an excuse. I don't know if that's correct, but is looking for the good in him. Is that a typical reaction, assuming she's a domestic violence victim, that she's trying to find maybe the one thing or the two things that are positive attributes?
Sure. I mean, she has a selective memory, right? So she holds on to the things. Well, remember the time he did this for me, or remember the time that he did that for me, or remember the time he helped my mom. And often, the person who's the violent person will engage in what's called love bombing, meaning every time they hit the person, they show these overtures of affection. They'll buy them a dozen roses, or they'll buy them expensive gifts, and that's how the cycle continues. And then the person who's with them say, well, they're not so bad. He gave me a dozen roses, or he bought me a car, or he took me out to a nice dinner. And so they selectively look at the things that are positive, and they edit out the things that are negative, and they rationalize. They tell themselves a tale to get themselves to stay. Oh, but he's a really great father, so it's okay that he beats me up. So this is very common in these types of personalities of a battered victim. This sort of learned helplessness, where you're so beat down and your self-esteem is so low that you're willing to put up with anything, and you make excuses for the person, and you rationalize everything.
And,
Those,
and
Joel, if you don't mind me jumping in, the letters, I just happened to read those tonight because I've been reading the federal case file. And the letter in which she makes that claim is accompanied by two other letters, one from her mother and one from her sister. And they are writing these letters to the judge while he's contemplating sentencing. And so they're trying to say good things about him and why it's a good reason for him to be home. And all three letters they tell the same story in different words, almost as if maybe hypothetically or possibly an attorney told him, well, this is a good story to tell. It's the same story. In my estimation, it's blown up. I mean, he heard his mother-in-law wreathing in pain, and he attended to her. And ultimately, when the doctors came and whatever, her life was saved.
Which is something that you should do out of basic
Right.
human decency. But for
Right.
him, it's hitting it out of the park when you compare his other behavior.
Exactly. It's heroism. It's not
Right.
heroism. You heard somebody calling in pain in your home, and you responded to it.
Right. That's how we're setting the bar with him. Right.
Right.
So we had on the last episode a attorney on. Her name is Ann Munch, and if you Google her, she's one of the preeminent experts on domestic violence. She testifies before the Senate, helps the Department of Justice out. And so, Dr. Bober, I'm curious from you, because I asked her this question as sort of a public service. I know there are people who are watching this who might be stuck in a bad situation of their own, a domestic violence situation. What advice would you have to someone to try to get out? And it's obviously much harder done than said. But what advice would you offer?
Well, we know that 1 out of every 3 women and 1 out of every 4 men have some form of violence in their relationships, and we know that domestic violence and domestic abuse is a public health problem of great significance. What I would say is they need to have a safety plan. They need to mobilize all their resources, family, friends, police, clergy, all the community resources they can. They need to, very, very methodically plan it out. Everything from changing the passwords on their computer to where they're going to put their pets to who they're going to stay with to emptying out the bank account. Because again, the most dangerous time where most of the violence occurs is when they're leaving the relationship. So they have to do it in a very, very covert manner until they're ready to leave and put all the pieces in place. And once they're gone, they really have to put themselves in a place where their abuser doesn't know where they are, because that's the most dangerous time.
Very well said. So another bit of news, and then we'll move on to some comments. We'll get final thoughts, and we'll wrap this up. But so Brian was allegedly not the only one who was having some meltdowns. They had tenants, the Walshes did, and now former tenants, and they say that Ana descended into what they described as an epic meltdown shortly before her disappearance. They went on to say it was like a whole other Ana. This person's name is Mandy Silva. She actually spoke to the New York Post. She said that her and her husband confronted the Walshes late in December about their plans to sell the apartment that they rented to the Silvas. And she goes on and says, Kate Middleton, Meghan Markle, or the Queen. This tenant says they present and carry themselves very professional. That was Ana. But when we put our foot down, meaning the tenants, she basically slammed her foot down. And she said it was like watching Britney Spears having a meltdown when Justin Timberlake broke up with her. It was not normal. What about this side, Doctor, of Ana Walshe, where could it just be that there was so much pressure mounting on her from an external factor like being potentially an abuse victim that she just couldn't handle the stress anymore?
Well, I think this woman had the weight of the world on her shoulders. If you think about our own lives, when we're under stress, when we're under pressure, and people come to us and say, "Hey, can you do this for me?" Or, "Hey, can I pick this up from you?" Maybe we're going to be a little short with them. Maybe we're going to be a little bit irritable. Maybe our frustration tolerance is going to be a little bit lower. But when you think about what this woman was going through, maybe believing that her life was in danger and that her whole life was about to be turned upside down into, pure chaos, I think she probably wasn't herself. She probably had been traumatized and abused for a long time, and that was probably out of character for her.
Anthony, to you, the story doesn't end there. This tenant couple says that Brian responded to all of this, to the meltdown from Ana, saying that Brian texted me back writing, "I'm sorry for the delay. I lost my phone and my son just found it," which sounds like an excuse that's made up, right? "My dog ate my homework," which is actually not too shocking if it's coming from this guy who appears to be a con man. But the tenant said something interesting. "I'm shocked he didn't say, 'Sorry for the delay. My wife is missing. Have you heard from her?' or anything like that." You're a seasoned investigator, Anthony, law enforcement. Is that something that would catch your eye? He can't seem to keep things straight,
Sure would, and it sounds familiar. That's the same sort of approach he took with the excuses, the real lame excuses for the things he did related to the art crime. Sounds identical to it. And yeah, of course. I mean, if if your wife is missing, my wife hasn't been home all day. I feel, I'm a little worried about her. That's one thing. Maybe you don't mention that to the people. Your wife is missing. That's a whole different ballgame. I mean, I personally, God willing, I will never be in that situation. But if my wife was missing, I would report it immediately. And secondly, if someone was giving me grief about their tenancy, I would probably say, I have much more important things going on in my life. Can we
Right.
please
Or I have a
this
family
meeting?
emergency right now.
Yes,
Right.
exactly. Right. So his pushing that off, it really comports with his behavior and not calling the police immediately when he felt she was missing weight. And it wasn't even him, if I remember correctly. I think it was her employer who initially called on
Yes,
January
Jim
4th.
Floyer was not
Yeah,
him.
it wasn't. Right. So that's again, it's that sort of behavior, but the doctor spoke to it really eloquently. It's this sort of, I'm smarter than everybody else. And, not even being able to see, boy, this is really bizarre behavior, because he just sees himself as a higher intellect. So he can't even understand what the normal person would do because he's above it.
I wanted to mention this way higher up in the show, but obviously our thoughts are also with the three children. Their ages 2, 4, and 6. They are in the custody of the Massachusetts Department of Children and Families. And, let's hope that Anna shows up somewhere, although it's not pointing in that direction right now. But the real victims, obviously, in addition to her, would be the 3 young kids. Let's move on to some viewer questions and comments. This first one, I'll throw to the doctor. It is from Kelly Showstall. I've watched 2 episodes of this podcast with domestic violence experts now, and I may have missed this point, but I think it's important for women and people in general. We think that we can fix or change an abuser. I have a friend who runs a home for abusers and tries to rehabilitate them. And he has said that this particular personality type almost never changes. Would you agree with that, Dr. Bober?
Very challenging. Not impossible, but I think more often than not, that is the case.
This comes from Maureen Casey, and now that there's more information out there, I don't know if this holds water, but Anthony, she writes, it seems that she had no idea of the danger she was in, these poor children. It sounds like she may have known a little bit, right?
Right. As the doctor said, there's no way of knowing, especially someone who probably doesn't even live in the same town. It's so hard to say what she felt or what she knew. It's impossible, frankly.
And so when Brian Walsh walked into court for his arraignment this past Monday, he had a kind of a wry smile on his face, Dr. Bober, and I never knew that there was a term associated with it. It's called duper's delight. And this person writes, I love that phrase and first heard it in regards to Chris Watts, who killed his wife and children and put them in a barrel, when he thought that he was fooling law enforcement. Duper's delight, the smile on his face. What is that all about?
Callousness, zero remorse. The fact that he's pulling one over on everyone and he thinks he's smarter than everyone else. And he thinks that this whole investigation is some exercise in futility and he's going to beat it all. We see this with organized crime figures. We see this with serial killers. They'll sit, at the defense table and they'll look over at the family of the victim and they smile at them. Again, more of a sort of a psychopathic trait of someone who has absolutely no remorse and absolutely takes pleasure in inflicting cruelty and pain on someone else.
There's a famous story in Massachusetts when the head of the Boston Mafia was arrested in a full restaurant by a team of FBI agents. As they were pulling him up from the chair and putting the handcuffs on him, he said, "I'll be back before my veal is cold."
That's great.
Right, and he was gone for 30 years in federal prison.
Sounds like a mobster. This next one comes from Leon Alioni. Art fraud is a serious crime in itself. Anthony, this is your wheelhouse. How serious a crime is art fraud, and how prevalent is it?
Oh, it's pretty prevalent. In fact, when I wrote the book, The Art of the Con, back in 2015, it tells a different sort of art fraud in each chapter. And the epilogue, I was talking about how frequent this happens. And what I did at that moment was I searched for the ongoing cases at the minute I was writing this. And it's just so many, and they just continue because people really are attracted to the idea that they can get something of very high value at a bargain or have something that no one else can get their hands on. So the dupes are out there, even people who are willing to spend tens of millions of dollars. I worked a case where a person spent around $13 million on paintings. I didn't even have to look at the paintings to figure out it was a fraud, that this person had been conned. It happens all the time. It's a serious crime, but like in Brian's case, the main charge, because the feds get involved, is a wire fraud because he used eBay. So a lot of times it has, for the FBI to be involved in the interstate transport, interstate commerce type of thing, it's a wire fraud charge. But they can bring serious sentences.
Anthony, I hope those paintings over your shoulder are authentic. I'll have to have a word with you. Dr. Bober, this one comes from LKK. It's a super long comment that I'm going to tighten up here. Maybe Ana was just waiting for him to be sentenced on this federal fraud case, and the minute he started serving time, she had her ducks in a row and was going to be out of there. I'm sure she had a removal plan once he was in prison, and it was easier and less messy and wouldn't further aggravate his alleged toxic, controlling, abusive behavior. Her friends say Ana spoke to Brian 3 times a day, either for her to keep track of kids or for him to keep track of the poor babies. This goes to your point. It's just so hard to extricate yourself, and you're thinking, well, maybe one day, maybe when he goes to prison, I
Goes
can
away,
do it, right?
right? That would have been the simplest, right? That would have been the simplest way if it would have happened, but maybe his ego couldn't handle that. You talk about narcissistic injury, narcissistic rage. If I'm going to go down, I'm going to take everyone with me, and you're not going to win. So if you think you're getting out of here, if you think you're moving on with your life, forget it, because I'm going to take you out. You're not going anywhere.
Anthony, this one comes from Great in Full Effect. They fall in love with cash. They're talking about these fraudsters, I think, and live the cash lifestyle. No cash, no love. Sounds like a nice business transaction. I'll be honest, I'm not sure if he's talking about Ana or Brian here, but what factor do you find in these art fraud cases? I mean, is it always driven? Is it always a financial motive, or is it people who are sociopathic and just have no conscience who kind of get off on it?
I think the certainly antisocial is 100%. It's a money motive, whether it's theft or fraud. The motive is money, and that's an interesting thing about these forgery cases is that they're never committed out of necessity or desperation. This is a plot, and it's planned by someone who considers themselves smarter than the average person, and comes up with this idea to dupe people. And whether it's a great idea or not, it works. And greed factors into it because usually they pull off a few of these before they're caught.
A final comment. We'll get some final thoughts and wrap it up. This one comes from a friend of the show, Chico's Mummy. And Doctor, I'll send this one to you. Jekyll and Hyde, more faces than a town clock. These people are popping up everywhere these days, praying for poor Ana. I guess with the advent of social media and like we were talking about like the disingenuousness of Facebook and Instagram, does it seem like there are more of these inauthentic, for lack of a better term, con artists out there in the world?
Oh, I think they've always been there. I just think that with social media, with digital technology, it's easier for them to commit their crimes, and they're more widespread and they're more far-reaching. But I think they've always been there. It's just much easier to facilitate those crimes now with technology.
He is an expert in matters related to security, fine art, and in the theft of highly valuable property, including rare masterpieces. One of the world's top experts in the field of stolen art investigations. He's also the best-selling author of Stealing Rembrandts, The Art of the Con, which was a New York Times crime bestseller, and The Woman Who Stole Vermeer. And he just wrote an article in the Boston Globe called Brian Walsh and the Art of the Sloppy Con. Anthony, final thoughts on this case and where it might be headed?
Well, I would say to people that are viewing or listening to this that it's always important to remember. I mean, I'm fascinated by these cases as well, but the investigators know a heck of a lot more than we can possibly know. So try to reserve your judgment on what they're doing, how long it's taking them to do it, and what you think the answer is. Try to be more of a passive observer than someone who thinks that they know the answers, because there's a heck of a lot of stuff that the police know right now that the three of us have no idea about.
And now that you just said that, I'm gonna ask you a question I shouldn't be asking because of what you just said. But do you think a murder charge is coming soon?
Well, I will say this: the stuff that they found on the internet searches, the fact that they found blood evidence in the basement, the fact that they're searching through dumpsters and disposal areas, does not, at this moment, even though it hasn't been declared a homicide investigation, from what we can see publicly, the investigators seem to be looking for a body rather than a person who's just fleeing her family.
The other gentlemen, they're both in blue sport coats with bluish shirts, so it's hard to discern, but you know who I'm talking about. Dr. Daniel Bober is board certified in general psychiatry, child and adolescent psychiatry, and forensic psychiatry. He's also a certified addiction medicine physician. Are some people just addicted to the con, doctor? And again, any final words you might have for victims of domestic violence?
I think some people have what's called a high arousal threshold. Some people ride roller coasters, and some people like the rush of committing a crime. They get a surge of this chemical in their brain called dopamine. Whether they're pulling a job, pulling a heist, robbing a bank, they just live for that thrill. And I think there's a movie, I believe the movie Heat, where Tom Sizemore says, for me, the action is the juice. And so I think there are people like that. And as far as domestic violence, I think that all the people who are listening out there, both women and both men alike, you're a person of worth. You deserve better, and you can get out. The unknown is scary, but don't continue to put yourself in this situation. Get out and have a life worth living. You deserve better.
After two episodes today, one on this case, the Ana Walshe case, as well as what is happening in Idaho, I am completely drained of dopamine, but don't you worry. We'll be back soon enough with another episode of Surviving the Survivor. Love you, America.